Good afternoon, and welcome to the 24th Annual Hesburgh Lectures in Ethics and Public Policy. My name is Kaufman, and I'm the director of the John B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. The Kroc Institute established the Hesburgh Lectures in 1995 in honor of the Reverend Theodore M. Hesburgh, CSC, educated at Notre Dame and the Gregorian University in Rome. Hesburgh, better known to all of us as Father Ted, was ordained as a priest of the Congregation of the Holy Cross in Sacred Heart Church in 1943. At the age of 35, in June 1952, he was named the 15th president of Notre Dame and served in that capacity for 35 years, until 1987. Father Ted built the modern Notre Dame, overseeing not only the rise to prominence of the university and the ranks of American higher education, but also the transfer of university governance from the founding religious community, the Congregation of the Holy Cross, to a predominantly lay board of trustees in 1967, and the admission of women to the undergraduate program in 1972. The commitment to peace and justice and to exploring the ethical dimensions of public policy characterized Father Ted's career as a charter member of and chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, as member of President Ford's Presidential Clemency Board, as member of the board of the Overseas Development Council, as chair of the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, and as a leader of a coalition of scientists and world religious leaders in condemning nuclear weapons. He was the recipient of the Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, bestowed on him by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and the Congressional Gold Medal bestowed upon him by President Clinton and congressional leaders in July 2000. Three related international institutes are part of Father Ted's legacy at Notre Dame: the John B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Helen Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and the Center for Civil and Human Rights. All three are now an integral part of the Keough School of Global Affairs and continue to grow and thrive. In the Chronicle of the Kroc Institute, we often tell the story of the historic presentation Father Ted gave at the University of California, San Diego on April 3, 1985, titled "The Nuclear Threat to Humanity as a Moral Problem for Higher Education." So it happened that he was actually filling in for a colleague who was originally slated to give this lecture on a different topic. So it happened that in the audience sat John B. Kroc, who listened to the lecture. They had never met before. After the lecture, Joan Kroc approached Father Ted and said she would like to help him. From there began a strong friendship between the two, which led to the establishment of the Kroc Institute and its development to become a global leader in peace studies. Father Ted's concern about nuclear proliferation began years before that historic lecture. He was a permanent Vatican City representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency from 1956 to 1970. However, in 1981, there came a sharp turning point in his thoughts and activism concerning nuclear weapons. On November 11, 1981, Notre Dame joined 250 colleges across the United States in dedicating a whole day to the study of the nuclear threat to humanity. The Nuclear Day, as it was known, became a moment of epiphany for him. On that day, Dr. James Mahler from Harvard, who was a Notre Dame alum and the co-founder of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, gave a lecture at Notre Dame entitled "Consequences of Nuclear War." It's important to note, in the context of this event, that in 1985 this group won the Nobel Peace Prize for their anti-nuclear weapons activities. Father Ted commented on the impact of Dr. Mahler's lecture in his 1985 presentation in San Diego, and I quote from that presentation. "Suddenly, on a gray November afternoon in 1981, following Dr. Jim Mahler of Harvard's graphic lecture on what would happen to Notre Dame and South Bend, Indiana, if a 1 megaton bomb was exploded over it, I was walking back to my office, thinking that this great university and all the other problems that had preoccupied me for so long would suddenly become totally irrelevant. No humans, no problems. From that moment on, Father Ted made the struggle to eliminate nuclear weapons central to his political, religious, and educational activities. By 1985, when he gave the lecture in San Diego, he was already fully immersed in this topic here on campus, in church, and in the global political arena. In his lecture, he argued that education shapes not only the mind, but also the whole human person, and that the university's role is to shape the future of the country and the world. And out of all moral issues that are of concern for the university, it is the nuclear threat to humanity that is the gravest. Father Ted defined the nuclear threat to humanity as, and I quote, the greatest moral problem confronting humanity today or ever. The university, according to him, has a moral obligation to lead the way in the struggle for complete nuclear disarmament. He said, if we do not learn and teach our students how to cope with this primordial nuclear problem, we need not worry about all the others. After total nuclear conflagration, all human problems are moot. What we need, Father Ted argued, is a worldwide awakening of moral indignation, pushing the governments and their military establishments to get rid of these weapons, which in the long run endanger everyone and protect nobody. He believed that educators could and should be leaders in this movement for nuclear disarmament, so that to reverse the present headlong movement toward the ultimate catastrophe that would be an end to all we hold dear, to all that is good and true and beautiful, to all persons. It was Father Ted's concern for nuclear catastrophe that triggered his determination that Notre Dame should have a peace institute to educate peace builders from all over the world on the dangers of nuclear weapons and other threats to human security and dignity. It was Joan Kroc's interest in anti-nuclear action that brought her to that lecture delivered by Father Ted. It was their shared concern for nuclear disarmament that constituted one of the primary reasons for the establishment of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. It is therefore more than befitting that this year the Kroc Institute hosts Miss Beatrice Fihn to deliver the 24th Hesburgh Lectures in Ethics and Public Policy. Beatrice Fihn is the executive director of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, or ICAN, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning campaign that works to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. In ICAN's press release, acknowledging and thanking the Nobel Selection Committee for awarding them the prize in recognition of their role in achieving the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, they write, "This prize is a tribute to the tireless efforts of many millions of campaigners and concerned citizens worldwide, who, ever since the dawn of the atomic age, have loudly protested nuclear weapons, insisting that they can serve no legitimate purpose and must be forever banished from the face of our earth." I would like to think of Father Ted and Mrs. Kroc as two among the millions of campaigners and concerned citizens worldwide to whom ICAN paid tribute in this press release. As executive director of ICAN, Beatrice Fihn has become one of the primary leaders of this global campaign. Oftentimes in such events as the Hesburgh Lecture, the introducer speaks about how pleased he is to welcome the distinguished speaker. I am indeed extremely pleased that Beatrice accepted our invitation to deliver this year's Hesburgh Lecture. With the threat of nuclear war looming again, and with the plans for increased nuclear capabilities in Russia and the United States, raising awareness and calling for global activism on this topic is an existential imperative. I only wish 73 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that 73 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we would be able to welcome Beatrice to deliver a lecture about the success of the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, rather than talking about our continuing obligations to do so. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Beatrice Fihn to deliver her lecture, Fire and Fury, the moral, legal, and rational argument to end a nuclear threat for good. And one last note, please don't forget to turn off or silence your phones. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm incredibly honored to be here today, and thank you very much, Professor Kaufman, and everyone at the Kroc Institute for this invitation and the very warm welcome from the entire Notre Dame community. Although I must confess one slight disappointment. I love sports, all sports, but there really isn't a lot of college football in my home country of Sweden, nor is it in my current home country of Switzerland. And I understand that Notre Dame may have a team. And maybe, if I could offer a small suggestion, that this distinguished lecture, which is now the 24th, probably should be scheduled in the fall. Preferably during a week of a home game. And I kind of imagine that Father Ted would approve of that. And speaking of Father Hesburgh, his spirit, faithful leadership, and profound words continue to resonate through this community, and indeed the world. He was a vital and consistent voice challenging world leaders over many decades to place the people impacted by their decisions at the center of deliberations. And through his commitment to a moral and humanitarian stance against nuclear weapons, rooted in his faith. He signed the treaty establishing the International Atomic Energy Agency on behalf of the Vatican and served as a leading voice for the Holy See and the Catholic faithful for many years on the nuclear issue. And more importantly, he was a resolute defender of humanity in the face of nuclear destruction through his last days with us. And I can only hope that my words today will in some way measure up to his well-deserved esteem. And just in case, I intend to quote him quite often. And to begin, I want to ask you to visualize something. Imagine that you're at home, relaxing in your bed early on a Saturday morning, maybe debating with yourself whether or not to get up, maybe head out for a run, probably not. Make some breakfast, or just stay in bed. And you're being interrupted by a buzz, a high-pitched ping coming from your phone that you can't ignore. Maybe it's a flood warning, Amber Alert, and you grab your phone to silence it and greet it with the following message in all capital letters. Ballistic missile threat inbound. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. You start to begin to feel panicked. What do you actually do? Seek shelter? Underground? Is there a fallout shelter somewhere here? Or do you stay put? Do you turn on the news? Try to find a radio somewhere? Pray? Call your family? Who do you call first? Will the missile be here in seconds, minutes, hours? Run? Where? Or maybe you had a big night. You're in bed with the covers over your head to ignore the morning light. Did you hear that strange noise on the phone, or was it just a dream? And you put a pillow over your head to drown out the sound. You hear it buzzing again, someone's calling it, ignore it. Someone left a long, long voicemail. Who leaves voicemails these days? Oh, mom, probably. More buzzing, more pings. Why didn't you put it on silence before going to bed? And finally, you give up sleep and glance at your phone. And scanning from the top, you see messages after messages. Missile attack. Honey, take shelter. I love you. If you're sleeping, wake up and call immediately. WTF. And finally, you see the source of all of these urgent pleas, the warning alert that the missile is inbound. And when you click on it, a robotic voice begins speaking, a last-minute addition to the protocol for the vision impaired. And the eerie voice says, the US Missile Command has detected an inbound missile threat. A missile might impact on land or sea within minutes. This is not a drill. If you're indoors, stay indoors. If you're outdoors, seek immediate shelter. We'll announce when the threat has ended. Take immediate action measures. What on earth is immediate action measures? As I'm sure you figured out by now, this is not actually an imagined reality. These messages are real, just as the alert that greeted the residents of Hawaii on the morning of January 13. And in Hawaii, mothers hustled confused children into closets. Siblings debated staying put or driving to be together. Some ran to the beach, thinking being near the ocean would increase their chance of survival, and then hurried back when Googled what to do during nuclear attack. One father wrote of his deliberation to either head back to the airport where he had just dropped off his teenage son, or go home to be with his frightened younger children and wife. He decided to go home, reasoning that it would be better to die with the largest group of his family possible, but wondering if leaving his teenage son alone was horribly cruel. And no person should be faced with these horrible choices. For too long, nuclear weapons have been the forgotten threat. The weapons of mass murder, hidden below us, aboard planes, in our oceans. And too many of us were content to ignore the threats and just assume that somebody was in charge. That there were cooler heads and experts dismantling this threat, ensuring that the nuclear wintered fear during the Cold War would remain only in our collective imagination, receding day by day. But the past 2 years, that reality has changed. The cooler heads, the reasonable voices we envisioned controlling our nuclear missiles, turned into men shouting on Twitter about the size of their nuclear button. And we could no longer ignore these objects of global destruction buried by the thousands beneath our feet. For 39 minutes, 1.4 million American citizens asked themselves the question that William Faulkner, when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature, said is the only question: when will I be blown up? And Father Hesburgh pointed out during a lecture on higher education that the nuclear threat holds a special place compared to all other global concerns. He stated, after total nuclear conflagration, all other problems are moot. And there are two profoundly striking aspects of the father's speech where he uttered that phrase. The first is that the lecture on the problems facing higher education, he spends the majority articulating nuclear problems and insisting that solving it must be at the center of all our activities and education efforts. And the second is how devastatingly familiar his account of the situation reads. He was speaking in 1983. And Father Hesburgh said that the increased concern about nuclear weapons stems from the current accelerating trend to utter disaster. He writes that in the past 2 or 3 years, it has been escalating upwards. And rather than a vivid time capsule of the past, Father Hesburgh's description is tragically and perfectly accurate today. He says of the nuclear threat, it is not just theoretically there, it is targeted, poised on a delivery system, hair-triggered to a very fallible computer. We could transpose his words wholesale today. Only the names of the weapon systems changed. Well, it's not entirely accurate. We also would need to add onto his list the new states possessing nuclear weapons. How can it be that 35 years after he penned those words, and nearly 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, we still spend each day at hair-trigger from total annihilation? And our fellow global citizens practice hiding, and they stockpile food in order to survive the great famine that will await survivors of nuclear war. And our friends in Hawaii and in Japan, where a similar warning was sent to phones just days later, know the abhorrent feeling of imminent death and the potential loss of all they hold dear. And we must admit that the promise of nuclear disarmament during the post-Cold War era has given way to a new reality of proliferation. And at the heart of this problem has been the global failure to reject nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction and instruments of great evil. And we forgot to label them as inhumane and illegal. And that is what ICAN and many of our partners across civil society, in governments, and within communities of faith changed with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in this lecture, I will discuss the moral, legal, and rational arguments against nuclear weapons and for the treaty to prohibit them, And each element is certainly distinct, but I also hesitate to separate them. It's because it's important that we understand that the moral argument informs and enhances the legal and rational arguments. And the legal argument is rooted in humanitarian law, which is anchored by shared moral values. And the rational argument actively supports legal implementation and reasonable decisions based in the greatest moral good. And I highlight this now because our detractors often try to limit our cause. They paint us as moral, idealistic radicals, detached from reality and law. Though, I suppose if opposing indiscriminate mass murder is radical, we are. The fact is that these three pieces together form a coherent and comprehensive and reasonable argument for nuclear abolition. So we begin our journey to the treaty where all discussions of nuclear weapons must begin, the Humanitarian Consequences. And I'm not an ethicist or theologian or philosopher, so I will again lean on the illuminating and clear words of Father Hesburgh to frame the moral and spiritual reality. He said, "It has to be the worst sin, the worst blasphemy, to utterly destroy God's beautiful creation, planet Earth, the gem of our solar system, and all that we have created here, so painstakingly, in a few thousands of years, all our institutions that we have labored to perfect, all learning, all science and technology, all art, all books, all music, all architecture, every human treasure, everything, but especially millions of men, women, and children, all the future and all futures, utter obliteration at worst, a return to the Stone Age at best." And the potential for nuclear total annihilation, notwithstanding, is worth highlighting a paradox we find in our work, and that has been bolstered by communications research in other fields like climate change. The nuclear threat can feel so overwhelming and the destruction so complete that the public's instinctive response is denial and immobilization. And Martin Luther King Jr. eloquently explained, "The fact that most of the time human beings put the truth about the nature and risk of nuclear war out of their minds because it is too painful and therefore not acceptable, does not alter the nature and risk of such war." And this does not mean that we should shy away from discussing nuclear weapons' unmatched ability to cause immediate mass casualties. Even in a relatively sparse population, like where we stand right now, one nuclear warhead would cause anywhere from 10,000 to 300,000 deaths, hundreds of thousands of injuries, utter obliteration at worst. But we must also communicate that the nightmarish reality for those left behind. The immediate effects of a nuclear blast will be devastating. Those that don't die in the fires of the initial blast or in agony the days following would face death for years to come in forms of radiation poisoning, cancers, environmental change, food scarcity. And recent climate modeling shows that a relatively limited nuclear exchange would result in a nuclear winting lasting for 2-3 years. Beyond the acceptable immediate deaths from nuclear weapons, millions more would die from the resulting famine. Our food system would collapse, and our societies would likely follow. And the effects of radiation on human beings would cause suffering and death decades after the initial explosion. The Stone Age, at best. And our colleagues, the 3 times Nobel Peace Prize laureates of the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, have made it clear that the destruction resulting from a nuclear change, even just one, would be devastating beyond anything we have seen before. And no adequate humanitarian response would be possible. And this has also been confirmed by the United Nations' own relief agencies, who've said that they would have to withdraw staff and would not be able to send anyone in to help in the affected area. The Cold War face-off of superpowers made total nuclear war the most probable scenario, even if just one missile was launched. But today we face a world where the nuclear threat has spread, and it's just as likely as that a limited exchange will create long-term effect for billions, or an accident or a mistake. Sadly, we do not have to resort to models to understand the long-term consequences of nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan recently signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the Soviets used their country as an atmospheric and underground testing site for 40 years. The 456 nuclear detonations at Semipalatinsk have harmed generations of Kazakhs. In that area, 1 out of every 20 children is born with serious deformities. And sickness increases every time the wind picks up and blows over the atomic lake. The selection of most testing sites, including Kazakhstan and the Pacific Proving Grounds like the Bikini Atoll, Australia, surrounding islands, or French Polynesia and Algeria, was rooted in colonialism and racism. And those who care about justice must speak out against the injustice of nuclear arms. The expression of this injustice has come in the targeting and testing of nuclear weapons on indigenous communities and those who deemed subhuman by ruling powers. Many of the Kazakhs I mentioned earlier were ordered to stand outside as warheads exploded. And when they complained about death sickness and birth defects, they were told it was due to their inferior genes. Nuclear weapons are instruments of inequality and tools of oppressive patriarchy. Though the weapons are indiscriminate, the impact is not. And women and girls are disproportionately have borne the impact of nuclear testing and attacks. Women in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had nearly double the risk of developing and dying from solid cancer due to ionizing radiation exposure, according to studies. And women face increased risk in childbirth with greater likelihood of stillbirth and physical malformations to the child, leading to increased maternal mortality. And robust research on the impact of radiation indicate that children have a higher risk of cancer from fallout, and girls are considerably more likely than boys to develop thyroid cancer. And these are the direct risks to women and girls of nuclear war. But we know from past and current conflict that women and girls also carry the burden of war and instability with a heightened risk of exploitation and sexual violence that goes hand in hand with displacement and breakdown of institutions. And ignorance and carelessness that also expose continental United States to destructive levels of radiation. The total atmospheric release of radioactive material at the Nevada test site is estimated at 12 billion curies. The Chernobyl disaster released 81 million curies. And new research suggests that the impact of these tests have been grossly underestimated. And historic measurements of the tainted milk supply suggest over 300 to 700,000 cancer deaths can be directly traced to these tests. Even if a nuclear weapon were never to be used again, never exploded over a city, there are intolerable effects from the production and testing and deployment of nuclear arsenals that are experienced as an ongoing personal and community catastrophe by many people around the globe. And this and motivate efforts to outlaw and eradicate nuclear weapons. There's a great immorality at the heart of the current nuclear strategy. High-level discussions about nuclear weapons often revolve around sterile and abstract concepts of deterrence or stability. These words, and even mutually assured destruction, are designed to desensitize us, to numb us to the reality of what is being discussed: indiscriminate mass murder of civilian populations. It's a gross contradiction that we would never allow a rogue state to threaten to kill thousands of civilians with chemical or biological weapon, but the richest and most powerful democracies routinely, implicitly, and recently explicitly threaten to exterminate millions and destroy the gem of our solar system. In addition to being immoral, these threats only increase tension. It is hard to blame fragile states for seeking nuclear capabilities when they have heard the message for decades that nuclear weapons increase power and security. And as Pope Francis said in his communication to the treaty negotiating conference, we also need to ask ourselves, how sustainable is a stability based on fear? when it actually increases fear and undermines relations of trust between people. The Holy See, as well as the United States Conference on Catholic Bishops and their European counterparts, have been supporters of our work. And the Holy See was first in line to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in November, together with some faculty members here and students from Notre Dame, I was honored to be with His Holiness when he stated, as the leader of the Holy See and the global Catholic community, for the first time, that the possession of nuclear weapons and the threatened use of such weapons was counter to Catholic teaching and human morality. He said the existence of nuclear weapons is in the service of a mentality of fear that affects not only the parties in conflict, but the entire human race. And they cannot constitute the basis for a peaceful coexistence between members of the human family. The abolition of nuclear weapons is an urgent humanitarian, moral, and spiritual necessity. And the only nuclear policy that increases security is the only human, rational, and responsible one: the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted by 122 states at the United Nations on 7th of July last year. The treaty will carry legal weight or enter into force once 50 states have deposited their instruments of ratification, and we expect this to happen within the next 2 years. The foundation of the treaty is international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And humanitarian law includes the principle that limits on the methods of and means of warfare exists and applies to parties in conflict. And the rule of distinction obligates states to limit targeting to combatants and never civilians. And the genesis of this rule traces all the way back to the St. Petersburg Declaration in 1868, which seems shocking and quaint now. Russia had engineered a bullet that would explode on contact with soft substance. And the Russian government thought that the weapon was so dangerous and inhumane that they refused to use it in conflict and organized that other nations would join them in a declaration to reject that weapon. From the very first rules of war, we see the injunctions on causing injury, on unnecessary suffering, protecting the natural environment, and of course rules governing proportionality. And the UN Charter itself requires states to refrain from not only the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, but even the threat of such force. And I could list treaty after treaty, and rule after rule, international, domestic, military laws that are incompatible with the testing and use of nuclear weapons. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons not only clarifies and highlights that this applies to nuclear weapons too, it also includes a prohibition on the possession and threatening of use of such weapons, and makes that illegal under international law. And I know maybe perhaps this moment in history, it does not seem like a particularly good one for international law and cooperation. But treaty-based solutions work, imperfectly, of course, but they do work. And entry into force will not be the end of our work, nor will the day when every nation has ratified the treaty be the end of our work. There will be much more work to do, more attitudes to shift, verification to be agreed and enforced. But treaties prohibiting and regulating weapons have been by far a net positive for the world. That same study that offered more accurate measurement of the fatalities caused by US nuclear testing also shows that the partial test ban treaty, the prohibition on atmospheric nuclear test, alone has saved 11 million lives on the very low end estimates. And we can there also conclude that the comprehensive test ban treaty has added more to that number and prevented more people from grave suffering. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, an ICAN strategy, follows in the footsteps of those treaties and also the treaties prohibiting chemical and biological weapons, landmines and cluster munitions. Because history shows that the prohibition of certain types of weapons is the first step towards their elimination. Weapons that have been outlawed by international treaties are increasingly seen as illegitimate, losing their political status. Arms companies find it more difficult to acquire funds for work on illegal weapons, and such work carries a significant reputational risk. And banks, pension funds, and other financial institutions divest from these producers. This shifting of norms is crucial in international law. And we should always seek to enshrine our values and rules in ironclad treaties and national law. But treaties that express public conscience and principles of humanity has a normative impact globally. For example, the United States still has not joined the majority of states in the world signing on to the ban on cluster munitions. But as of November 2016, no US manufacturer is willing to make such weapons. That was when Textron noted in an SEC filing that they were done with cluster munitions because they were simply bad for business. And in our field, 2 of the 5 top global pension funds have this year divested from companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons, citing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this will only increase as more states join the treaty and tighten regulations around supporting the nuclear arms manufacturing. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was the missing piece in a puzzle of treaties that aim to control and limit nuclear weapons without firmly rejecting them. And we now have the legal basis for achieving nuclear disarmament. But of course, though we have the treaty, we must still wrestle with naysayers who simultaneously accept that a world without nuclear weapons is preferable, even necessary, whilst claiming it is impossible. The very first UN resolution, all the way back in 1946, called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Winston Churchill suggested empowering the UN to control the world's arsenal. And the very man who ordered history's only nuclear attack, Harry Truman, turned around to tell Congress that the weapons should be restricted by international agreements and not controlled by one man. And many of the very scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project organized and signed the first petition calling for the abolition of the weapon they had just created. And we have seen over 70 years of heads of states pledging to work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Most recently, when President Obama and Russian President Medvedev agreed to the Nobel goal and followed the world's words with signing of the New START Treaty. And even more recently, President Trump mused during the State of the Union that, and I quote, "Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons." And actually, Mr. Trump, that magical day did happen on July 7th, 2017. The message we've heard for so long, even within the text of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is that yes, we must work to eliminate nuclear, but no, we can't. And what I see in this message, and too often across various issues, is a confusion, whether by ignorance or design, between the impossible and the inconvenient. And efforts towards meaningful change, towards equality and justice, is often portrayed as impossible by those in power, by those who benefit from keeping things the way just they are. And they are trying to discourage us from demanding change. But change will come. It's inevitable. We will not live with nuclear weapons forever without them being used with catastrophic consequences. If you ask a mathematician, they will tell you that the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used at any given time is greater than 0. And just how likely that risk is fluctuates. Right now, the likelihood is definitely higher than it was last year, thanks to a growing threat of conflict. But the chance is always greater than 0. And that means, given enough time, it is certain that nuclear weapons will be used. So let me then ask this question to those who accuse us of being naive and irrational. If you know that this story will end with either the use of nuclear weapons or their elimination, who is the irrational one? The person who calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons and works towards it, or the person who thinks it's okay to live side by side by them? We are not naive, we are not irrational. We simply will not do nothing because doing nothing is to accept the eventual use of nuclear weapons. And the British philosopher Bertrand Russell said this clearly in noting his opposition to nuclear weapons. You may reasonably expect a man to walk a tightrope safely for 10 minutes. It will be unreasonable to do so without accident for 200 years. And we are going on 73 years of walking this tightrope, and our time is already running out. Father Hesburgh said, "It has to be utter insanity for rational creatures to have painted themselves into such a corner, to have created such a monster. But in freedom, what we have created, we can uncreate and dismantle, and we must." We should never minimize the destructive force of these weapons. Even one so-called low-yield nuclear weapon will end tens of thousands of lives and pollute land and water for decades, possibly even centuries. But we must simultaneously remember that these are just weapons, created by man, and we can abolish them for good. While they stand ready to launch at a moment's notice, they are not self-guided or autonomous. They are not magic. Their computer code is written by people. Their parts are built by companies with names like Lockheed Martin, Bechtel, General Dynamics, BAE Systems, Airbus, Boeing, with funding from many of our banks, pension funds, and investment funds, with names like Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Vanguard, BlackRock. And the order to launch a nuclear attack is given by our leaders. In the majority of nuclear armed states, those men, one woman, are democratically elected. And a large part of ICAN's mission has been to bring democracy to disarmament. Because nuclear weapons are, by their very nature and the structures we have put in place, authoritarian. Their use betrays humanity, their continued development betrays reason, and their stockpiling betrays democracy. And in this room with students and educators today, I hope that some of you may hear a call or feel a pull to commit yourself to this work. And in addition to Father Ted, you will be in the great company of many alumni of the Notre Dame and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. There is, of course, no shortage of problems facing the world today. And we who look will find injustice on every corner. We are right now faced with a climate catastrophe in the making, skyrocketing inequality, food shortages, the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, xenophobia, children being shot in schools in this country, sexism, racial inequality, the continued use of chemical weapons violating international treaty obligations and norms, just to name a few. And all of these causes need energy and new voices committed to justice. But often the threat of mass killing through nuclear attack slips dangerously out of sight as a problem of the past, until it suddenly explodes into the public and threatens to literally explode. As a graduate with a law degree, I did not imagine myself standing before you today in this position. But I was drawn to nuclear arms, the issue of nuclear weapons, because of the absurdity of it all. The world is held hostage by the most vicious weapons of mass destruction ever conceived. We are told they must never be used, but we keep building more and more. And I find in the celebrated photo of Father Hesburgh interlocking arms with Martin Luther King Jr., an encouragement to pursue justice in all its forms. Both Reverend King and Father Ted understood that nuclear weapons are instruments of injustice. In fact, Dr. King spent a significant portion of his 1964 Nobel Lecture discussing the dangers of nuclear war and the need for global, nonviolent, collective action as a counter. If we are to win on this issue and ultimately abolish nuclear weapons, which I believe we will, the victory will be rooted in the unwavering courage of generations going back to the Hibakusha, the survivors of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so many who have steadfastly rejected nuclear weapons, including the victims of nuclear testing. These generations, including Father Hesburgh, fought against man's darkest instinct during the most threatening moments of the Cold War. And we are only here because of them. But now new voices need to rise. And the next step needs young people, like many of you in this room, to take up the mantle and boldly claim enough. We need the new generation, and especially young women, to stand against the nuclear threat. We need optimism in face of doubt, fresh perspective in face of entrenched old-fashioned beliefs, creativity in the face of impediments of progress, and hope in the face of fear. Now, I don't believe that women are automatically more peaceful than men. But what I do know, and what I've seen in my work, is that women bring unique viewpoints and competences. And it's something that has been often ignored in policymaking on security and defense. For sustainable and just solutions to this issue, we need women leadership. And it was largely women who challenged our movement that a change was needed and a legal mechanism based in humanitarian law would provide a breakthrough at this critical time. And it was a woman who chaired the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations. And women have led the movements across disarmament, building the foundations of humanitarian law, from the founding of the Red Cross to Jody Williams' struggle against landmines, and many of my colleagues' work for a ban on cluster munitions and a treaty regulating the international arms trade. And the great deception of the nuclear era was to convince us that we had no power, no agency when it comes to the threat of nuclear arms. That the difficult, the uncomfortable is impossible. That security is based on fear. And they pressed the fallacy that we can maintain our humanity while threatening mass murder to those who cross us, even genocide, as the US president has on Twitter. This status quo is irrational, inhumane, and untenable. And I've shared some insights today from Father Ted and a few other celebrated men, so I would be remiss to not close with some empowering words of two iconic American women that I think strongly represents ICAN's path forward, and which I invite you all to join. Susan B. Anthony succinctly described the process for creating historic change when she said, "Organize, agitate, and educate must be our war cry." Or more direct or contemporary, if you prefer, "Power is not given to you. You have to take it," by Beyoncé, the queen of America these days. We reject nuclear weapons. We reject security based on fear and luck. We reject a world order sustained through threats of mass killing and environmental destruction. We reject fury. We embrace humanitarian law. We embrace rationality. We embrace a just world order based in cooperation, and we embrace faith and hope, and we are not going anywhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I think we have some time for questions, and Aaron is with the mic. David.
Thank you very much for such an inspiring and insightful set of remarks. And very helpful for us to be reminded of this important mission, and especially the leadership of Father Hesburgh in creating this institute and working for this goal for so many years. Could you maybe help us think through how to break this down a little bit more in terms of our American context, and maybe say a word about the so-called nuclear modernization that's underway now? I don't like that word. It's actually a nuclear rebuilding, and actually building up new capacities that the United States is undertaking over the next 30 years. It's already underway, costing $1 trillion or more. And Russia has been doing a similar program of building and enhancing its capacities under the euphemism of modernization. Say a few words about that, and what is that one of the kind of political goals that we could work towards on the way towards the abolition of nuclear weapons for the treaty?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, all 9 nuclear armed states are engaging in huge modernization programs, rebuilding programs, which really is a sign that they intend to keep these weapons forever. And we have to ask our politicians at that point if that means that they are accepting the use of nuclear weapons. We know that if we keep them forever, they will be used. There will be a nuclear bomb detonating one day. So engaging in these modernization programs means that that's what they are preparing for. And in this country, which cities are you prepared to sacrifice in order to keep your nuclear weapons? DC? New York? LA? I think it's really, we really need to keep asking our politicians these kind of questions. If they are going to continue to put this kind of money into these weapons, they are going to at least have to tell us what the consequences of that are at the end of the day. So I think it's definitely, it's something to focus on. And I think that the money issue, the amount of resources going into these weapons, which only purpose is to prevent itself, is enormous. I don't have the figures in my head right now, but it's I heard something about it was like $70,000 per second for the next decade or something like that. It's absurd amount of money. So I think that's definitely a huge thing to fight about and to get our governments to stop investing these monies. We have also worked a lot with divestments to put pressure on the companies that are producing these weapons, because someone is making money on the threats of fire and fury. Someone is banking on chaos and Armageddon. And we have done research in a report called Don't Bank on the Bomb, where we list the producers of nuclear weapons, those that are building these weapons for governments, and which of our banks and pension funds and other investment funds are providing them with the money to do it. And that is something that people can take action on again, to tell their banks. We need to make it difficult for them. And we've seen that with cluster munitions, for example. The decision to cut that from their portfolio was easy as soon as it became a burden. These companies are in the profit sector, so it's also it's another way of making an impact that isn't perhaps on governments but on the private sector. But I think that the modernization, the rebuilding of nuclear weapons. Trump announced a new nuclear weapons policy in January this year, which tries to build new, small, more usable nuclear weapons. And there's no definition of what a small, more usable weapon is. But the average size is way bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. So by today's standard, the bomb over Hiroshima would be small. And that was built so that the threat of using them would be more credible, as if we're not already nervous enough that someone will use it. So we're seeing a very dangerous, and it's very urgent as a first step to back off on that, to reduce the spending on these kind of weapons. And I think that sometimes we look at nuclear disarmament work as a kind of a all or nothing approach. Well, you haven't succeeded yet, it's a hopeless case. But the efforts that went down on preventing the atmospheric nuclear testing in the 60s, the big nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s, the nuclear test treaty in the 90s, probably saved us. I think we have to also realize what we have achieved. We have prevented huge escalations because of that kind of work. And this is the moment where we have to do that work again. We're seeing countries like the United States and Russia go head to head and arguing about, a new nuclear arms race. We might not be so lucky this time. So this is really the moment where we urgently demand for our leaders to pull back.
Let me ask you, with all your work around the world, most most people assume that if we could get to denuclearization and ending nuclear weapons, it would come from the creation of a new security system. Where do you find the most hopeful ideas or the seeds for people thinking about and working on a new security system, and what could a place like Kroc do to boost that along?
Yes. In many ways, I think we have the security system. We have international law, we have international organizations like the UN, the EU, other different organizations, multilateralism, cooperative security. So I think that's already a path we're on. And somehow we just forgot about the nuclear weapons and sort of left them behind without fixing that problem. In a way, leveling entire cities, carpet bombing, is not the sort of way we solve problems today. And very few states, I think no one actually wants to see nuclear weapons used. No one would like to see that. So it's a little bit of a, we just forgot to adapt that, our nuclear weapons policies to a modern world where conflict is completely different. It's not World War II in that way anymore. We have built up different systems already. So I think that we have this new security system. We need to strengthen it. And I think that academics and researchers and peace institutes need to contribute by supporting normative behavior, develop norms, looking at treaties and international regulations, looking at diplomacy. I think that's another big challenge we see right now. It's a sort of moving away from diplomacy as an appropriate solution to problem. We've seen that also on Twitter. That's where we see most things these days. Kind of a mockery of diplomacy that, they try, President Trump was mocking Rex Tillerson for trying, talking about the diplomatic solutions. And I think that has to do with very, almost a gendered view on how to solve problems. That somehow compromising and coming to an agreement that works for both parties would be weak. Whereas bombing and taking what you want by force is strong and powerful. And I think we really need to challenge that and look at negotiations and diplomatic solutions as real strength, where it's a win-win situation.
Thank you for giving the lecture. You mentioned that you expect the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to receive the 50 ratifications necessary for it to enter into force within 2 years. I wanted to know what mechanisms are being used to ensure ratification by these 50 state parties, and whether maybe social movements or political pressure exerted on states to do mechanisms like, for instance, the boomerang effect would be an appropriate tool, especially for the 15 states who have already signed the treaty. And I also wanted to know what other mechanisms can be appropriate to adopt in this case.
Yes, absolutely. So ratification, I don't know how familiar everyone are with legal terms like that, depending on if you study law or not. You see some nods. But it's a tricky process, and it looks different for every single country. You had, for example, the Holy See that could sign the treaty and ratify. They don't really have a parliament, so it was very quick for them. Whereas you have a country like the United States, where you need, 2/3 of the Senate to approve something, which is tricky, I've heard. So of course it's different for different countries. But it means basically that you need to harmonize the new treaty in national law and prove that. So either you get a legal review and realize that our national laws are already in place, or you develop new laws, and that takes time. So looking at other treaties, like the prohibitions on landmines or cluster munitions, the arms trade treaty, and other recent agreements, it's taken most international agreements about between 18 and sort of 40 months to get to 50 ratifications. So we're hoping for a similar pace. Right now we have 7 since October, but we know that there's at least 3-4 is coming in a few weeks, and many are in process in parliaments, but it takes a little bit of time. And yes, definitely, we need to mobilize people, and people need to pressure governments to get on with this. It's very easy for small countries to sort of put it on a shelf and like, yes, we'll do it later, especially if there's not an active debate about the issue nationally. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we would really need to be in touch with all these governments, mostly non-nuclear weapon states, to really pressure them to get on with it so that it can establish to be international law. And obviously, even though it's international law, it will not apply to the states that haven't joined the treaty. So the United States will not be legally bound by a treaty they haven't signed. But international law still matters. It still impacts governments. And this is why some of these states have been so resistant of this treaty and try to stop it from happening. They stopped countries from saying it at the United Nations that they wanted it. They tried to stop countries from voting in favor of setting up negotiations, try to stop countries from participating, try to stop us from coming into the UN. When the treaty negotiations started, US Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, held a protest outside the conference room in the United Nations. I think it's the first time I've ever seen them do something like that. She actually gathered some, France and the UK and a bunch of other states behind her who are all supportive of the US nuclear weapons, to stand outside a big conference room where the majority of states were gathering to negotiate. And to me, sort of, wow, they're really scared of us. It's very unusual that they behave in that way. If it was truly insignificant for them that we did this without their participation, they wouldn't bother. But they have put a lot of effort into trying to stop it. And I think it's sort of, we see that on many other social issues as well, how people in power suddenly get really scared when the marginalized rise up and take control over a situation and push forward. And they become very angry when you challenge their power. So I think that it's, for us, it's a sign that we're on the right track.
Thank you for your lecture and for your comments so far. So as someone who's only followed this on the periphery, I'm curious if you could maybe shed some light on the North Korea situation. And so, especially as of the end of last year, we saw, as you referenced, escalating Twitter battles, and what seemed, especially in commentary, a really big disaster on the horizon. And then only, I can't remember if it was last month or the month before, we all of a sudden have a potential talk between leaders on the table with denuclearization. And so I'm curious, how do you think we got to this place, and how do you see it unfolding from here?
I think one of the big weaknesses of attributing so much power and prestige to nuclear weapons is that you can have a country like North Korea develop them and then be demanded to be treated as an equal, in a way. And so in many ways, we have conceded all this power to North Korea right now, making them one of the most important countries in the world, where they probably aren't, in a way, without their nuclear weapons. So I think and there are arguments around nuclear weapons, why they have them and what they're going to do with them and their threats of using them. It is very similar to the United States and the other nuclear armed states. It is for our security. We are reasonable, rational nuclear armed states. We just need them for security, for protecting our people. Same kind of arguments. So you have this a situation where it's really difficult to tell another country that you can't have that. Well, I want to have that. In many ways, the South African delegation at the treaty negotiations coined the term nuclear apartheid. A small select group that holds all the power and won't let everyone else have the same rights. So it's definitely I think we're making ourselves really vulnerable as an internet. But by clinging onto these weapons, we are making ourselves vulnerable to a country like North Korea, in a way that we wouldn't if we rejected nuclear weapons in total. And the reason for, in many ways, I mean, I'm very into this whole gendered perspective on this issue right now. But it's like, I demand respect. I want this big bomb so people will take me seriously. It feels like a very sort of childish kind of tool to empower yourself. It doesn't help when Trump says, my button is bigger than yours. It's like, what are we talking about here? But I think that it was one of the things that came out of these recent months was a really smart work by South Korea, who realized that they are in the middle of this as well. A non-nuclear weapon state who will be impacted. If Donald Trump totally destroys North Korea with nuclear weapons, that will impact South Korea. That will kill South Koreans. That is not in their security interest. And they put a lot of effort throughout the Olympics, through sort of showing kind of stroking their ego in North Korea and welcoming them and saying, let's sit down and talk, which seems to be what I think a much more effective way of getting somewhere than threatening to totally destroy a whole country. We don't know, though, of course, what's going to happen with this. I'm not sure anyone, even in the US or North Korean governments, know what's going to happen with this meeting. It might be a huge success. It might be a total disaster. I think it is, though, unlikely that North Korea will suddenly give up its nuclear weapons just like that. I think it's going to take a lot of work. I think they're also watching very closely what happens with something like the Iran deal, which is a hugely successful diplomatic victory, where governments managed to get Iran to agree to very strict controls of their nuclear energy production to ensure that they can't develop nuclear weapons in return for a lifting of sanctions. So this typical win-win situation. Both sides were happy, yet the United States now think that's a bad deal and want to break that up. And I think that would be extremely dangerous for the North Korean situation, because why would you want to engage in a negotiations when Iran did that and look what happened? So I think that's a risk we're facing right now, and a really dangerous one. I think it would be extremely stupid by the US government to rip up the Iran deal. I think it was a hugely successful agreement. So we'll see what happens with North Korea. I think it is very difficult to solve one nuclear-armed state in isolation from the others. I think if we're actually going to make progress on nuclear disarmament on any of them, we're going to have to start with reducing nuclear weapons and rejecting them as a legitimate means. I think that as long as we cling on to these weapons are important for us and we are prepared to use them, it's going to be very difficult for the other nuclear-armed states to get rid of them.
Thank you for your eloquent and passionate talk. I have to admit that your talk not only made me feel scared, but it also made me feel old. In that, I realized that it's about 40 years ago that I was, marching on the streets as a 14, 15-year-old in high school, at rallies that David Cartwright was organizing, in New York City and Washington, D.C., for the nuclear freeze and others in the 70s and early 80s. And I was also a high school student who was having nightmares about nuclear Armageddon at that time. So some of those same emotions kind of came back to me as we were talking. So one of the ways that I dealt with that was to become a student, a scholar of social movements, and to study the dynamics of the social movements, ones that I grew up within. So I'm wondering if you can tell us in that light, if you tell us a little bit more about, you give us a very strong sense of your normative vision. If you can talk a little bit more about your strategic vision from the point of view of the organization's role as a social movement organization, as activists who are looking strategically at this field of action. Like, so what, for example, like what is your power map? Who are the allies? Where do you build the coalitions? Are there institutional partners? Are there particular sets of pockets of elites, that might be important to engage, or there are pockets of citizen oppositional power. So, and then on the other hand, who are the high priority opponents? Whether they're corporate or government that you think that these coalitions should be targeting, and what are the points of leverage, to kind of engage with these targets. And then finally, what is your tactical? How are you thinking tactically? Like, are you thinking about a combination of inside or outsider tactics? Ways in which a combination of kind of conventional protest with more confrontational approaches. So just give us a little sense of the inside, the inside strategic view as activists that your organization is thinking about as you really are thinking very seriously about bringing this kind of normative vision into reality.
Yeah, really exciting question to get into. I think in many ways, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we have a sense that the previous nuclear disarmament movements have failed, which I really don't think they have. It's like saying that, look at all this, the Me Too movement on all the sexual assault, the women's rights movement has failed. I mean, instead we're building on each sort of step and wave. So our work builds very much on the big movements from the 80s, from the 60s, and all the way from since 1945. But what we tried to do was to broaden it a bit and use the humanitarian narrative. And I think that has, in a way, basing the work around the human impact and human stories was in many ways also what was done in the 60s and the 80s, but we lost it somehow in the 90s and early 2000s. It became a bureaucratic, expert, technical issue, where people that were engaged in this issue mainly wrote really long and really boring reports and sent to a policymaker somewhere, and there was no kind of public conversation about it. So what we wanted to do was broaden it, to perhaps also broaden it from the traditional peace movement that was during the Cold War. And as a European, in particularly, trying to get away from this kind of US-Soviet mentality that existed. The peace movement was often accused of being anti-US, pro-Soviet, and trying to just have a different kind of rebrand ourselves in a way. You can use that kind of thing. The movements around human rights, environment, humanitarian issues have grown exceptionally, and they are extremely influential. So trying to frame the issue around humanitarian work and humanitarian perspective in order to get other actors on board. And I think we in particularly worked very strategically by focusing on emergency relief organizations, those that would respond in nuclear detonation. Instead of leaving this to the suits in DC and London and Paris and Moscow, we went to the people who would actually have to handle the consequences. It's not the president who's going to scoop up dead bodies afterwards. So the people that actually have to do that. And also the people who have experienced it. Who are the real experts on these weapons? It's the people who know how it sounds, know how it smells, know how it feels, have seen their family members die of it. I think we're seeing a little bit of a parallel to the gun control issue here right now, and on who has the agency to talk about these things. And I think that the human stories are really important. So we're trying to make it broader. So also try to remove it from a traditional left-wing, right-wing issue. And we have a lot of work still there to do. But making it a humanitarian issue, making it anchored in humanitarian law, in human rights, we try to move away of a traditional left-wing, right-wing. In particular, for example, countries in Europe where there's supposed to be cross-party support for things like the Geneva Conventions and human rights. Obviously, things are going for the worse, and suddenly human rights is political again. But that's sort of the kind of aim. And the tactics was really about building from the ones that already do support us. And I think that there's this wonderful quote from Martin Luther King Jr., I can't quote it directly from Birmingham letters, about what the real problem was. It's not the Ku Klux Klan, it's the white moderates, those that say, yes, I do support you in principle, but not right now, not like this, you're being too pushy, give it time. And I think that we have seen so many parallels to those other justice issues. So the people in power who are like, yes, I do support you, but not like this, not too much. Because it's their power that they're going to give up, and they're never going to do it. So you have to mobilize the supporters. And that meant to us the humanitarian organizations. We work very consciously. ICAN is not a organization that's built on individuals, but on NGOs. So NGOs are organizations, those that already have members and constituencies and spheres of influence, and try to use existing networks. And then the governments, those governments that are supportive, start to build a group of governments and work very closely with them. Work with agencies like the United Nations, the Red Cross, these sort of international organizations that are also supportive, and try to build this kind of pressure. And then you have someone like the Pope who suddenly comes and has a huge influence that we can rally. So we work very, try to find groups that are influential. And often also, we have a habit, maybe in all kind of activist work, is to try to start with the worst actor and try to convince them. Which is really counterproductive. Like, you need to start with your friends in a way and then build the huge majority so that they become marginalized and really uncomfortable over there. So a lot of people will listen to us talk and say, well, North Korea is never going to change. Why are you fighting about Germany? It's North Korea that's a problem. Well, Germany is kind of part of the problem as well. It has American nuclear weapons on its territory. Its military participates in plans and preparations to mass murder civilians. And the German government does not like to talk about that. So you have the 9 nuclear armed states, of course, that have the nuclear weapons, but you have a lot of other states around them that are actually enabling them. So we also, by building this majority of states, we're kind of working inwards. And I also think that in many of these issues of progress, we have this, we have to get everyone on board, otherwise it's a failure. But I like to think of it more as a stair. We need everyone to get a step up. So those that are already really good, they need to be even better. Those are on the sort of middle, they need to get up, and those are the worst, we need to drag them along with us. And that's huge progress if we can get everyone to move a step up in a way. So I think that's the kind of thinking that we have had a habit of setting the bar based on Russia and the United States. And that's the only thing that matters. And that is extremely disempowering for not only all other governments, but also people, if you feel like you can't change that. And now we've set a bar really high up and trying to get one country at a time up to this high place. And by working with numbers, there's a beauty in international law that a country like Fiji, or Cook Island is about to ratify the treaty in a few weeks. One country, the United States, one country. Under international law, they're the same. And obviously we know that some are more powerful, influential, but it is a little bit of a beauty in the numbers game. So we've worked a lot with showing so the majority of states in the world are supporting this and are getting on board to also inspire people in the difficult countries in the United States. So when we have a victory, yesterday, Bolivia signed the treaty. Their president was in the United Nations in New York and went past the UN legal office and just signed the treaty quite spontaneously. Everyone gets to celebrate, even our American campaigners who feel like they are not making a lot of progress these days, but they get to be a part of a movement that feels like it's moving forward.
Maybe one before last question. I'll reserve the last question for me.
Prerogative.
Thank you. So the dinosaurs went extinct because an asteroid hit the planet. And I think I read that NASA is tracking an asteroid that could intersect with the orbit of the Earth and have a plan to deflect it. And that involves the use of ICBMs and nuclear warheads. So we have to reprogram them for the interception. So here's my question. Do we get rid of all nuclear weapons, or do we keep some to protect us from this kind of cosmic threat? And if we keep some, who keeps them?
Yeah, I've gotten that question before, actually. I don't think that there's about 15,000 nuclear weapons. I don't think that there are 15,000 asteroids coming around the world to get us. But of course, I think that this is a weapon of warfare, and it's built to level cities. And I think that that's really important to remember, that this, when you argue about nuclear weapons, there's always some lawyer who's like, well, technically you could use them without indiscriminate impact or things like that. But these are not made for, precision guidance targeting this military facility. These weapons are built to wipe out entire cities. And that's unacceptable today. In today's modern world, that's not what we do anymore. We don't just level a city in 10 seconds. So I think that the intention behind the weapon is also what we're trying to get to. If, when we get down to 10 weapons, we want to debate that question then, whether or not we should keep one under international control in case there's an asteroid, happy to have that one then. But now, we're not there yet, because we still have 9 countries and many other allies threatening to level cities with these weapons. And that's really where our focus should be. And speaking about dinosaurs as well, just because I have a colleague who always says that nuclear weapons are a little bit like, dinosaurs. They're dead, they just don't know it yet.
So I'll keep the last question from me. First, I want to thank you very much. This has been, I'm not sure, at times I felt inspired, other times I was so depressed and feeling bored, as Anne suggested. And following up on the question of Anne, maybe I was thinking about maybe a few takeaways that we could all leave this lecture with. Short of joining ICAN, moving to Geneva and joining ICAN, what could students, faculty, individuals be doing tomorrow? Practical things that would be constructive in this campaign that you may actually recommend us to do. And again, we are all living our lives, as you suggested yourself. We have so many other busy agendas and concerns, but I think we share here the concern that you have raised here. And I wonder if you can give us these, few takeaways that we could live with, so that tomorrow morning when we wake up, what do we do as individuals?
Yes. Well, obviously, you can be a part of ICAN as a supporter of ICAN. I mean, our official members are organizations, but people can join through email lists and things like that. And you can sign up on nuclearban.org or icanw.org, that's our main website. And that has all the information. And through that, we send regular updates on how the work is going and trying to keep people informed about the treaty and the process and some simple actions that people can do. I'm a big fan of giving people sort of simple actions. It's a lot of nuclear weapons activists are full-time, their whole life committed to this. You have these nuns that go to prison for this cause, and I think that you can start small. You don't have to go that far immediately. So really, as a first step, to sort of just stay informed. Sign up for our newsletter. One of our partner organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility, has a great new campaign that's targeting the US and particularly American universities. It's called Back from the Brink. And I can't remember the website, but you can Google Back from the Brink. And there's also trying to pull back the United States from these huge spending that is taking place right now. And then we have this Don't Bank on the Bomb report. You can check if your bank invests in nuclear weapons, if they profit on weapons of mass destruction. You can check if your university invests in this as well, and call for that to change. And start asking questions. Just go into your bank office and ask if they know, if they can have. Just those small things sometimes really freak them out. It's really interesting. When we launched this report in March, the Don't Bank on the Bomb report, I went to see some banks about it, some of their headquarters in New York and things like that. And it's just, when you've sat through a lot of meetings with governments who are so used to NGOs coming and criticizing them that it doesn't face them, they, whatever. And the corporate world is really, they get really nervous. It's like quite exciting to talk to them because they get really like, well, what do you mean you say bad things? Well, no, this is very difficult for us. And it's just like a little bit encouraging because you noticed, we put out the report and banks like BNP Paribas, one of the biggest banks in the world as well, or Deutsche Bank, immediately, within 2 hours, had to go out with a press release and give their version. Well, actually, we don't invest in nuclear weapons directly. Well, it's not like these companies ask for money for nuclear weapons. They ask for general money, and then they put the money in nuclear weapons. It's not like, yeah. So I think it's really, the private sector is also really interesting and something that could really have an impact while the current government isn't doing much in a way. And I think that we have to be really creative on how we work. And I think that the kind of resistance movement in the United States right now is really, in a way, exciting because people are coming up with new ways. And I think we also have to feel really, democracy is not about just showing up to vote every 4th year. Voting is very important, but democracy happens in between as well. And everything that we do with the current government matters just as much as going to vote. Politicians aren't leading change. You didn't have a precedent like 100 years ago. It's like, women's rights right to vote. I should do that. I mean, it doesn't come from them, or civil rights. Yeah, let's go get on with that. Let's develop some universal human rights declarations. That doesn't come from the current people in power. It always comes from people around who change the context in which politicians operate. And anyone who's followed them, they know that they say, no, that's impossible, until they say yes, and suddenly they've always supported that. And that's how it works. So we just have to create a context where they can't deny the issue, they can't ignore it. So yeah, back from the brink, nuclearban.org, don't bank on the bomb. It's 3 simple things.
Thank you very much.